Thank you for joining us for Back to the Beginning with Pastors Dennis Otero and Randall Westfall. This program is brought to you by the donations of our faithful partners.
Praise Him with the cymbals, praise Him with the dance.
Shalom, welcome back. We're glad you joined us for Back to the Beginning. I'm Pastor Randall, and I'm here with Dr. Dennis Otero from Olive Tree Fellowship. We are Maranatha Missions International Ministry. And we're going to continue discussing some of the things we began to talk about last week in terms of our identity as Israel and some of the implications of what it means to be grafted in, not set apart as something new, but grafted in to Israel. And, of course, we want our viewers to ultimately understand that our identity is in Yeshua. Our identity is in our Messiah, because He is the vine that we are grafted into. But can you give us some insight about living this new life that is based in Torah, based in the old ways of the life that really goes back to Avraham, goes back to faith in Yahweh?
You know, one of the most important things that we always need to say is that from last segment, we're talking about the continuity. And it's important for us to really say there's continuity. And this idea of continuity really begins in that idea of salvation by grace through faith. Salvation has always been by grace through faith. The identity of the person who is a follower of the Creator, of Yahweh, it's always been, from the time of Abraham, grace through faith. Abraham was saved by faith. It was by his faith that he received righteousness. Everyone who has ever been saved, who will ever be saved, it's always been by the grace of Yahweh and our faith in that grace. And so one of the things that we really need to start looking at this idea is our identity as Israel. Everyone, Jew or Israelite, but Jew is the term used in the first century, and any Gentile who's grafted in is identified as Israel. Our identity is Israel. This is who we are, and as you rightly said, our identity is Yeshua, because He is the branch, and Jew and Gentile is grafted, as we said last time, into this branch, this netzer, called the Messiah, Yeshua by name, and we're grafted into Him. He's our identity. But His identity is Israel. He is the prophet like unto Moses. He is the seed that when Abraham was promised, in your seed all nations shall be blessed, and your seed will inherit the land. That seed was Messiah. And so that's why Yeshua says, I am the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father but through me. That branch is the connection. Nobody goes through the trunk anymore. Everybody has to go through the Messiah. The Messiah of Israel is the key, and He is Israel. Yeshua is the Son of Israel. He is the one of which all the prophets spoke about. And in a sense, He is our identity. Now, one of my questions is, what is the implications of our research into this? I've really discovered that if this is so, if we are grafted in, whether we're Jew or Gentile, and people listening to us today, some of you are Jewish. And if you're Jewish and you believe in Messiah, you've been regrafted into the tree of Israel. If you're Jewish but you haven't accepted the Messiah, Yeshua, then you're still part of these dead branches. But if you're a Gentile and you're a believer in Messiah Yeshua, you believe in Him, you've trusted Him for your salvation, then, according to the implications of this research that we've been doing, then how shall we then live? How, being a grafted in person, how should our lifestyle be? And that's what we're going to talk about today.
So do you think Yeshua addressed that when he said, if you love me, keep my commandments? We've really not understood that as a believer, as someone who came to an understanding, as a teenager, as I did, that I was a sinner, and that to be restored to God as I knew Him. I didn't understand at that time that God is not a name, God is a title.
Right.
But I've learned a couple of things since those days. Hallelujah. But when I knew to be restored to a relationship with God, that I had to apply the blood of Jesus as I knew Him. And I knew He was the Jewish Messiah, and I knew that I was invited to participate, but no one really explained to me how all of this story connects. But really what I think I hear you saying is Yeshua connecting and claiming to be the prophet that Moshe foretold of in Deuteronomy 18 in verses 15 through 19. And Moshe was very, very clear to the Israelites who were going into the land. And he was not going with them because of his disobedience. Mm-hmm. But Yehoshua, or Joshua as we know him, was taking them into the land. But Moshe warned them, there is one coming like me, and you must obey him. You must respond to him, and that's the concern of, and that's why someone who is physically Jewish, someone who is a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob through a physical lineage, if they have not come to faith in Yeshua, they're not in the covenant.
Right. In fact, that's why it says that whoever does not listen to him, whoever doesn't listen to this prophet like unto Moses, will be cut off. And that's why those dead branches, because of unbelief, Paul says, are cut off. And that's why there in Romans 9, not all Israel is Israel. Not every physical descendant that says, I am a blood Israelite or I'm a blood Jew is part of the Israel of Yahweh, the Israel of Elohim. He is just a physical Israelite or a physical Jew. But Israel always has been a concept of a spiritual entity, and it is a spiritual country in a sense, a country within a country, a body of believers from the time of Moshe, from the time of the wilderness. Look at when on the first Passover, there was a mixed multitude that came out with us, with our ancestors out of Egypt. And so there's always been, the Torah has always been for whosoever will, just like salvation is for whosoever will. And so once you are grafted into the olive tree of Israel, then there's certain commandments, certain things we need to follow. Now when Yeshua says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Now let's just do one example of that. Yeshua says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. So the Christian church today says, well, Yeshua's commandments are not the Old Testament commandments. They're new commandments that he gave us. For example, in the Old Testament, they had Passover. Yeshua did away with that, and he gave us the Eucharist. He gave us Holy Communion. He gave us the Lord's table. And so they're saying, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. So Yeshua said, keep my commandments. Okay, now I give you this new ritual. Well, Buzz, nope, no, negative, that's not so. When Yeshua, and look at my fingers. Look at my fingers. When Yeshua was doing the Last Supper, and there's no place that it's called the Last Supper, he was doing what? Pesach. He was doing Passover. But watch my fingers. Yeshua said this, as often as you do this to remember me. So in a sense, Yeshua didn't start a new commandment. The commandment was always do Pesach. On the 14th of Aviv, you shall do the Passover. That night was the 14th of Aviv. Yeshua did not do it on any other day except on the 14th of Aviv on Passover. And he says, as often as you do this, every time you do Passover to remember me. So how often do we do Passover? Once a year. So Yeshua actually said, once a year at Passover time, you do this Passover with all the foods of Passover, with the unleavened bread, with the bitter herbs, and every time you eat this bread, the afikomen, every time you drink this cup, the third cup of the Passover Seder, you do this to remember me. Well, right there, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. So Yeshua's commandment there, in just this one example, this one instance, is not a new commandment, but the original commandment that Adonai gave us at Passover. Any Christian who is not celebrating Passover on the 14th of Aviv is disobeying Yeshua's commandment. Every time you do this, the Passover, do this to remember me. Any Christian who's celebrating the Mass, the Lord's Supper, whatever word the denomination uses, once a week, every day, once a week, once a month, once a quarter, whenever the board decides, whenever that religious organization decides, is not following Yeshua's command. Because he didn't say do it once a week. He didn't say do it once a month. He says every time you do this, which is once a year, do this to remember me by. And so when Yeshua says, if you love me, keep my commandments. And in this one instance, just one of many, we could actually cut and paste many of these things where we have now 2,000 years of additions and subtractions to the Torah, to the Tanakh, which they call the Old Testament. The Old Testament is called the Tanakh, and the Hebrew Scriptures and the Apostolic writings. Well, we have to follow everything that Yeshua said. Again, Yeshua being the default teacher of biblical, and I'll say this so everybody can understand, biblical Judaism. He is the default teacher. He is the rabbi. There is no other rabbi except him. He is the rabbi that we all must follow. He's my rabbi. If you're a believer in Yeshua, he's your rabbi. And again, Yeshua being Jesus, and Jesus is the name that today everybody uses. But again, and this is why the name back to the beginning is of vital importance, because we need to get back to the beginning. We need to become radical, become to the roots of our faith, and really start learning what is really the Christian faith all about. Is it about the 2,000 years of Christian identity, or is it going back to our Hebraic identity and the identity of the church, the Kehillah that we talked about last segment, is available now for us to really look at?
So the implication that I believe that I hear you saying is that we need to understand covenant in the way that covenant was taught and believed in the first century, when Yeshua came to correct the misconceptions, the bad teaching. He came to give us insight on, let's go back to the beginning. Let's let go of these traditions that we've embraced. Because I think and I appreciate you saying he is our rabbi, because rabbi is a term that is misunderstood.
Correct.
Rabbi is generally defined by most people as teacher. And so sometimes people take on that title of rabbi, which I do not do, and I know that you do not do, right, because really in the original language it implies the great one. Mm-hmm. And I don't think Yeshua warned us about taking on those kinds of those titles. We are not great ones. We are simply his under-shepherds who are trying to help our people understand what Yeshua meant when he was defining true biblical faith. And so one of the implications I believe that we both have have kind of put into process in our lives is that we've gone back to understanding the covenant the way that it would have been understood in the first century, and that would have been Jeremiah 31:31, and Ezekiel 36:37, where there's an explanation of being grafted into the tribes of Israel. It really doesn't matter which tribe we're grafted into. Our identity is not in the name of a tribe. Our identity is in the name of our Messiah, Yeshua.
Right.
And so how can we dispel some of these conceptions that there's a covenant over here for the Jews and then a covenant over here for Christians? A destination of a restored earth for the Jews and a destination of heaven for the Christians. Can you address that?
Well, first of all, I really feel that every one of a person who's listening, we need to, in a sense, open our minds to the Word and decide. There's two things that helped me do this. First of all, I came to the conclusion that, and nobody could refute me on this. I don't care what you say, you cannot refute me on this. Nobody can. I came to these two conclusions. First of all, I don't know everything. I've, been a pastor, have several doctorates, have all this. I don't know everything. Just because you have degrees doesn't mean you know everything. I came to that conclusion. I don't know everything. And I came to the conclusion as a Christian that while we may all be wrong, we can't all be right. Once I decided that I don't know everything, and while we all may be wrong, we can't all be right, that gave me the freedom to research. And with no political correctness, I said, what does the Scriptures say? And with no theological, denominational, because we are so heavily indoctrinated, and this is the way Christianity is. But this is the way Christianity is. Like, for example, in that same example I used a little while ago, communion. Whenever a Catholic priest says, as often as you do this in remembrance of me, when a Baptist preacher says it, when a Pentecostal, when a Presbyterian, each one has their own little box of Yeshua in that denominational structure, Yeshua being a Catholic priest, Yeshua being a Baptist minister, Yeshua being a Presbyterian, a Pentecostal, doing that, saying every time you do this, according to their model, saying this is the way he... Well, no, we got to dispel all that. We actually got to get rid, before we could really understand biblical truth, we have to decide what is tradition, what is theology, what is all this. In fact, in Paul's time, in the books of Timothy and Titus, he talks about strange doctrine. In fact, he talks about doctrines of demons. So even in that early date, other doctrines were starting to come in. He talks about another gospel. In the book of 2 Corinthians 10, he talks about another Yeshua, another spirit, another gospel. So all these things had crept in. And so if they had crept in the biblical time, in the apostolic writings, can you imagine all the stuff that has crept in the last 2,000 years? So part of our first understanding is finding out what is truth and what is error. What is tradition? So the way people do communion in the denominations, all that is tradition. That's all it is. But if we really want to find truth, we've got to find out how, when Yeshua says, as often as you do this, what was the this in Yeshua's time? What did he mean? Mm-hmm. And that only makes us do research. And again, research is of vital importance. Pure research where we say, okay, how was Passover in Yeshua? Well, we go to Exodus 12. And in Exodus 12, it shows us how the Passover should be. Throughout Scripture, the Tanakh, what they call the Old Testament, it gives us examples. Now, Yeshua takes that and we follow Yeshua's model. And we come back to truth, which means that we should be doing this today, both in Judaism, in the rabbinic structure, or in Christendom. The Passover is done differently. Everybody does Passover. Jews and Christians do Passover. But are they doing the biblical Passover or traditional Passover? Like the traditional Passover Seder of Judaism today, they've added the egg, they've added things, they've taken things out and put things in. Well, we need to scrap that. Scrap the traditional Seder. Scrap the Christian ways of doing communion. Let's just do the simple biblical. And by the way, that's where unity comes in. Unity really is when we scrap tradition, because it's the traditions that divide us. It's tradition, this tradition, this tradition. And so traditions are what are dividing the body of Messiah. But once we get rid of the tradition, say, let's follow what the Torah says. So what I've done in our congregation is I said, well, you know what? Sunday service is traditional. So let's scrap that. Let's go back to the Sabbath. The Sabbath is biblical. It's not traditional. It's biblical. It's not legalism. It's following the commandment. Yeshua says, if you love me, you will follow my commandments. You know, did Yeshua have Sunday church? No. And when did he fellowship? He had sacred assembly on Shabbat. He honored the Sabbath. So if Yeshua honored the Sabbath and he's my rabbi, he's my teacher, I'm going to honor the Sabbath. I'm not going to follow something that happened 300 years after he died. It wasn't until 300 years after he died that it became law. Now, right before that, in the 200s, in the Greco-Roman period, is when the early church fathers, when they started bringing in Sunday worship. But it wasn't made a law. In fact, it had to be made a law. If it was something that Yeshua and the apostles did, the church 300 years later didn't have to say, okay, by law now you have to, and whoever doesn't worship on Sunday, they will be excommunicated. Well, wait a second. You don't make laws like that. The only time you make laws like that is if everybody's following one way and you want them to follow your way. And so the implications of what we are doing in this, back to the beginning of this radical revolution, is we're going to have to change. And the first change has to come about by us saying, you know what? I want to open myself up to truth. And I want truth. I want to live by truth. I want to be a biblical, I want to be a, quote, New Testament believer. I want to have a New Testament congregation. A New Testament congregation will worship on the Sabbath. A New Testament congregation will do all these things. And there's all these implications that we need to do.
So keeping Shabbat is at the top of your list.
Vital.
And so, and there are different ideas on how one might keep a Shabbat. If we put 10 teachers in the room, we'd probably have 15 or 16 different ideas on what that looks like. And one of the things that maybe we can close with today is just kind of an idea of really what was intended for us to understand out of Leviticus 23. These Moedim, these appointed times, these times when Abba says, I want you to come and be with me. I want you to open up your day timer and set aside this time because I have something very special for you. The first one listed is Shabbat, is it not?
Exactly. In fact, one of the important things of the Moedim, the appointed times, is the actual word Moed. The word Moed. And again, Adonai gave us this in Genesis 1:14. Before he created man, when he set up the sun and the moon, he gave us the sun and the moon. He gave us the universe as a calendar. This was the original calendar. And he set them to be Ot, which is a sign. And so the sun and the moon are signs, calendars for the festivals. And one of the things that we know is that the word Moed means an appointment, a date, and a reservation. So he made these things for reservations, times, and dates. Now, he made the world, he created the universe in 6 days. And on the fourth day is when he created the calendar. But then on the seventh day, he rested. And he gave that appointment, that moed, he gave that appointment, that reservation, that date to Adam and Eve and their descendants. That means wherever you're listening to me, you might be listening to me in the United States, South America, Russia, China, Japan, wherever you're, Africa, the Amazon, wherever you're listening to me, the Sabbath was made for all mankind. The Sabbath was made for mankind because Adam is the signature man, mankind. Adam is the father, it means man. So he is mankind, and his seed is mankind. So the Sabbath at the beginning was the sign for mankind of them being followers of the Creator. Of course, paganism went away from there. They went away from that. Yeshua now in the New Covenant Scriptures says that I am the master of the Sabbath. Yeshua is the master of the Sabbath. In the King James, the Lord of the Sabbath. And he says the Sabbath was made for mankind, for the world. And so that is the premier sign of being a believer, being in the covenant, is the Sabbath, which I encourage everyone to now come back to the Sabbath.
Amen. Well, I want to continue talking about Shabbat as we go into future shows, but I'd like, you mentioned people being in all places around the world, but for those of you who live in New Mexico, and particularly in the Albuquerque or central New Mexico area, we'd like for you to join us so you can experience Abba Shabbat. We have services in Socorro. We have services in Albuquerque. They're on your screen. And please write me with questions that you may have, or email me, or give us a call. But Shabbat was made so that you can enjoy a day of rest in the presence of your Creator. So shalom, shalom. We will see you next time.
Maranatha Missions International is an apostolic fellowship of Messianic congregations and ministries. Olive Tree Fellowship services, Shabbat 10 a.m. with Pastor Dennis. Shabbat 4 p.m. with Pastor Randall. Trinity Fellowship Socorro service, Shabbat 10:45 a.m. For more information on Forerunner Torah studies, Olive Tree Fellowship weekly schedule, or direct questions to the pastors, email randallwestfall@gmail.com. Forerunners, phone 575-418-9334. Olive Tree, phone 505-352-1003. If you would like to send a donation to support Maranatha Missions Media Ministries, please send a check to Maranatha Missions, 2621 Cagua Avenue, Northeast, Albuquerque, New Mexico, 87110. Hope to see you next week.